Welcome to Beyond BIM. In today's interview, I delve deeper into systems thinking and flourishing systems within infrastructure. I had the pleasure to discuss this with my own fellow colleague, Dr. Jennifer Schooling, who is the director of the Cambridge Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction at the University of Cambridge. She's also an important lead academic at the Centre of Digital Build Britain, where we both contribute our research towards the National Digital Twin Programme. Jennifer is passionate about changing the way that infrastructure and construction industries view data to become a vital asset in its own right, and as an engineering tool for tackling key challenges that are currently facing our industry. Most importantly, climate change and the resource constraint and resilience. She reminds us that we most often lose track of what is most important when building infrastructure, and that we should keep in mind the value it delivers to societies and to humans ultimately. And now let's take a listen to what Jennifer has to say on her most recently published report on flourishing systems in infrastructure. Can you just start off by telling us a little bit more about yourself, Jennifer, and what led you to your current role as Director of the Centre for Smart Infrastructure at the University of Cambridge?
My route to this role wasn't a direct route. I started out doing a degree and a PhD in material science and metallurgy. And after I'd finished my PhD, I knew I didn't want to be an academic, so I went off into industry. And I got a job working for a company that made high-speed rotating machinery. And they employed me because they had a number of metallurgy and material science problems, but they actually didn't have that many. So once they were all sorted out, I had to do something. So I effectively became a mechanical engineer, and I ran a new product introduction team. So we were designing and developing new vacuum pumps. And then after I'd been doing that for about 7 years, I realised that I didn't want to do my job anymore, and I didn't want my boss's job or his boss's job. So it was time to go and do something else. So I had a year out teaching maths in an inner city school in San Francisco, which was a lot of fun, and then came back and ended up in a job working for Arup, the civil engineering consultancy. And through that, I got very involved in things around sort of sustainability and sort of big civil engineering infrastructure projects. So then when the job at Cambridge came up, it sort of seemed to marry my very strange career path, because it was at Cambridge where I'd done my PhD. It involved products in the form of sensing systems and analysis systems, but it also involved civil engineering. And I had never expected to find a job that would bring those three slightly curious and apparently unrelated parts of my background together. So I was very lucky that I got the job, and I absolutely love it.
That's really nice. So you kind of transitioned first from the trajectory in the academic course by doing the PhD, then going into industry and coming back. And I think that's quite common these days as well.
It's more common now than it was. I mean, when I was doing my PhD, we had a lecturer who had come back into academia from industry, and it was almost unheard of. And this was quite a few years ago now, 20 years ago. Whereas now it's very much more common for people to move backwards and forwards between the two. And I think it's healthy as well, because it helps expose the research community to the challenges of industry and industry to the outcomes of good research. So.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the bigger challenges that we have got, you really nicely summarize and write about in the recently published report on flourishing systems. So if we kind of navigate our conversation to that, what would you describe flourishing systems as, just to start out with?
Our purpose when we wrote the Flourishing Systems report was really to do two things. One was to highlight the fact that infrastructure is a set of systems, and they are pre-existing systems. They're not just a set of interesting projects that can be done sort of in isolation from each other. And the other was to highlight the fact that our infrastructure systems, and indeed our buildings and our built environment more generally, underpin human flourishing. when we live in sort of urban environments. So if you live in a city with poor transport links, no sewerage, no fresh water, and no electricity, really you're quite likely to be living in something that in English we would have called a slum, because urban environments are very congested and you need those infrastructure systems both to manage public health and to make the environment comfortable and pleasant to be in, but also to then foster economic growth and support the industries and the businesses and the roles and indeed the leisure activities that people want to engage in. You know, cities thrive because people want to be in them, but you need the infrastructure to support that thriving. So that was sort of where we were coming from when we wrote Flourishing Systems.
And in your report on flourishing systems, it states, and I quote here, "There is an enduring interdependency between infrastructure and society. It is a socio-technical system." So for the novice, let's say, if you haven't heard of this concept before, how would you describe a socio-technical system?
It's an interesting question, and it's one of these things that until you've heard of it, you don't think about it. But once you've heard of it, it becomes very obvious. So, you know, I'm an engineer. I was educated in a very technical environment, and we didn't really talk about the social side and the social impact of what we do, or indeed, you don't often always talk about the people who are going to use the outputs of your work. When I was working in my first job post-PhD, we did think about what our customers wanted, and we would have these wonderful marketing requirement specifications, but we, the engineers, never got to talk to the customers unless something went wrong further down the line, where there was a marketing interface between us. So really what we mean by socio-technical system is that any technology is in fact used by people, and hopefully it is used for the benefit of people. Well, particularly when you talk about infrastructure, that is the case. And infrastructure is created as a public good. And that means that people are both engaging with it in its delivery and in its use and getting the benefits from it. So you can't design it in isolation from the people for whom it is intended to bring benefits. And that becomes all the more important when you get to the sort of smart cities arena, because people are so inherently part of the city that you really do need to engage with the people who are going to use the system. If you design a wonderful transport system that no one wants to use, you've created a white elephant. It is actually not a wonderful transport system. You know, I can imagine that in these days of aiming for, you know, the net zero carbon solution, someone who's only thinking about zero carbon would come up with a transport system that, you know, uses no net carbon, possibly even delivers carbon sequestration. But if it's designed in a way that it's uncomfortable, it doesn't go to the places people want to go to, it's a pointless exercise. So you really do have to think about the people alongside the technology. How do they want to use things? What do they actually want out of a technology, if indeed they want a technology at all?
Why do you think that this is an important way of thinking when it comes to infrastructure? You said that these are assets for the public good. Why is this way of thinking important in general for that sector?
It's important because, as I say, infrastructure is inherently used by people. You know, we turn on taps, we turn on light switches, we get on buses and trains, we drive our cars on public roads. So if we fail to take into account people's needs and people's wants and the way people might end up using things, then we generally end up with a suboptimal solution. So if you can engage the user in defining what the need is and in defining some of the parameters, at least, as to what the solution might look like, then you're much more likely to end up with a solution that people will want to use and will get benefit from. And that doesn't just apply to the sort of the end user. So, for example, you and I turning on a tap or turning on a light switch. It also applies to the people who are designing and building and maintaining and managing that thing. You know, they are also people who are part of the system. So if you want to achieve a particular outcome, like, for example, I work in the world of data and wanting to get better data about our infrastructure systems so we can understand them better, understand their performance, and therefore improve, you know, the way we design them, build them, operate them, etc. if I'm asking someone on the side of a railway track to collect information, they need to understand why they're doing it in order to be fully bought into the process of doing it. Otherwise, it's just another thing they have to do, and they're, I'm imposing on them. If they understand how what they're doing benefits others, or better yet, if I make them doing that make their own job easier, then suddenly, they become a willing participant in that infrastructure system. So it's not just about the end users; it's also about all the people who make the infrastructure work.
I would say that when I think about this problem, I think about it from the point of view of how architects and designers approach buildings. So oftentimes they start out with the right intentions. They seek to delight people with buildings and spaces, and that's quite fundamental to the profession. And I'm sure it's the same in some sense with designers and engineers in infrastructure as well. But as we progress, we find that we move further and further away from the original intent for various different reasons. What are some of those reasons that you think there is this big divide from the original intent to where we then end up at the end?
I think it's often because the intent gets lost. And I'm very much with Judith Hackett, who's been conducting the inquiry into Grenfell and then the post-Grenfell sort of actions, as it were. She talks about the golden thread of information and how in building and sort of civil engineering, we don't have a good thread of information and understanding from the beginning of the design process to the end. In some ways, I talked about what I used to do in my first post-academia job where I was designing products. We were given a marketing requirement specification. And at the end of developing the product, we had to check it against the marketing requirement specification. We actually did that all the way through as well. We didn't just wait till we got to the end. But, if it didn't meet the marketing requirement specification, we either had to have a really good reason for that, like, the laws of physics wouldn't let us, or we had to go back and make it meet the marketing requirement spec. And I think when we design and deliver buildings and infrastructure, we might have a kind of very high level understanding of the marketing requirement specification, but we don't necessarily understand all of the technical implications of that. So when you think of something like Grenfell, nobody set out to make a building that was going to end up causing huge loss of life as it did. That was nobody's intention, but lots of things happened along the way. Lots of choices got made, sort of absent from the design intent at the start and absent from an understanding of what previous decisions along the line since that design intent was created had done and the impact that they'd had on the potential performance of the asset. And because of that lack of understanding and that lack of a thread back to the original intention, you sort of lose sight of the perspective. And often what happens then is that people focus on cost. I absolutely detest the phrase value engineering because I think it's just cost reduction, and we should call it that if that's what we mean. Value engineering is about bringing better value, not about reducing cost. Often what happens in these situations is people look for the lowest upfront capital cost, which, again, when you're designing infrastructure and buildings, but infrastructure in particular, you're designing something that's going to be around for 100 or more years. So you really should be thinking about the whole life value of that asset. It's absolutely insane to focus on the upfront cost of delivering the thing. Now, not to say you should just spend money willy-nilly, but to have that as the sort of almost the sole object of your procurement process and your delivery process is completely illogical. And I think that because we end up with that focus on cost, because it's an easy thing to count and measure, actually, then lose focus on all those other things that bring value, including, the delight that someone might get from being in a building, or the pleasure that someone might get from having a nice journey to work rather than being sort of crammed into a tiny tube carriage, nose to armpit with somebody else.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of what you're talking about in the report itself is obviously linked to a way of thinking, systems thinking. And you mentioned that infrastructure is a system of a system, or you kind of explain it in this manner. So is there a contrarian view that opposes to this, that might see being a system of a system as a negative thing? What's the opposing view to this way of thinking?
I think every kind of infrastructure is inherently a system. It's a system of things. I often like to use the railways as an example. So the railways consist of rails, obviously, and track, which needs to be maintained. But you've also got quite a complex signalling system. You've got a power delivery system in many cases. So you've got electrification for the trains. You've got civil engineering assets, so bridges, tunnels, embankments, cuttings. And all of those things need to be working in order for the railway to work. If you have a landslide, then you can't, then it blocks the tracks and trains can't run. Worst case scenario, you get a train derailed and you get injuries or loss of life. So a railway is a system, but it is inherently itself a system of systems. When you look at infrastructure systems, so water, electricity, gas, the highway system, etc., they are all very much bound up together. The water supply system cannot work in separation from the power system, because we have pumping stations and we have water purification and we have sewage treatment plants and so forth. The transport system cannot operate absent from fuel delivery, power delivery, the good functioning of the traffic signals, and so on and so forth. And quite often what you find as well is that even where systems are not necessarily sort of operating together and interleaved, they are physically aligned. So very often you will find that a bridge carries not only traffic, but also pipelines, cables, gas, water, electricity, sewage. They can all be within a bridge. So if a bridge washes away, you lose all of those systems. So we can't avoid the idea that infrastructure is a system of systems. All these things are interdependent. What we can look at, though, is how big that system needs to be. So, in the UK and in many of the sort of Western economies, we have quite centralised systems. And there is a question as to whether a very centralised system is the most resilient system, for example, or indeed the most appropriate system in terms of resource use or carbon emissions and so forth. So we can question the scale of the system. Should we be working with district scale energy provision, for example, or is a national grid the right way forward? Or is there, ultimately it's probably going to be a blended system where you have district scale energy and building scale energy, solar panels and things, but they ultimately are connected to a national grid. But if there's a failure in the national grid, everybody doesn't go down. But I think there is a question to be asked about what's the appropriate size of the system. And the answer to that question will be different in different contexts.
I think that probably links to when you say centralized and decentralized way of operating in similar sense with the use of digital technologies and whether or not a centralized or a decentralized approach is better. I mean, there's similar discussions just in digitization on the same issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when we talk about things like digital twins and the conversation around a national digital twin, I was also involved in writing the Gemini principles, which came from CDV. And in that, we talk about the fact that digital twins need to be able to be federated, and that a national digital twin won't ever actually be one big single thing, because it would be completely unwieldy for starters. Trying to grapple with that level of data and the different levels of granularity that are required by different stakeholders would just be impossible. So you've got to have, localized digital twins that are doing the job that's needed for the person that is custodian of that twin and curates that twin, but that these different twins can talk to each other and communicate and extract from each other the data and information that they need. So, for example, we've been working with Cambridgeshire and the Smarter Cambridge programme, and talking to them about what a sort of city-scale digital twin initiative might look like. And it would make no sense for them to try and have a digital twin of the power network in the city, because that power network is owned by somebody else. They almost certainly will have a digital twin themselves of that network. So really all the county council needs to do, all the city council needs to do, is to have an agreement with the people who own and manage that power system to share with them the data that they need in order to effectively manage and operate, the city scale systems that the local authority is responsible for. And the sort of level of granularity that UK power networks might be to make sure that the lights keep coming on will be very different to the level of granularity that the local authority might need to understand whether the local grid has the capacity to accommodate another 30,000 house development or something like that.
And if we talk about this vision, so both the vision that you describe in Flourishing Systems and also the Gemini principles for the national digital twin, how big does the current divide between this vision and also the way in which the businesses or the private actors operate?
5 years ago, I would have said that where people were thinking about data and information, there was very much an idea that data is power and I should hold on to it. Not in every organisation, but very much, the idea that my data is my data and I need to hold on to it and keep it because that gives me somehow a commercial advantage or some other kind of competitive advantage. I think the more people see the power of sharing data, the more they realise that actually working together and collaborating around data is very powerful and actually potentially leads to greater gains for everyone. Now, there are always going to be some limits on that. No company is going to completely open up all of their data for anybody else to come in and wander around. But the idea that you would have collaborative agreements around sharing data is becoming much, much more the norm these days. And I think, BIM and digital twins very much have contributed to that. The fact that if you are delivering a big infrastructure project, you've got to share data between the different contractors who are part of the JV and with the consultants who might have done the design work and so forth, has sort of brought that into focus. I think that the power of data really lies in what you can do with it when you share it, rather than what you can do with it when you sort of build a wall around it and keep it to yourself. So I think there is an increasing willingness and intent in business to do the sharing. I think the challenges come in how you get rewarded for that, because data is not a free resource. It costs money to generate and it costs money to curate. And I think we're still working out what the business models are to enable that sharing, but to enable people to be rewarded for the effort they've put into generating and curating the data, which also then brings rewards in terms of, because you want people to carry on generating and curating the data so that that you've got an ongoing quality source of data about an asset or a system or a situation.
I think that is a big challenge in its own right, isn't it? To understand the potential business models around digital twins. It's certainly of interest, even just outside of our sector. We always tend to think that the built environment is so far behind and grappling alone in these problems. But if you look at automotive sectors, aviation, they're in a similar situation when it comes to data sharing, when it comes to business models and monetizing the digital twin, because of its, as you mentioned as well, the cost of creating that data, and how do you appropriately as you said, reward those that are generating and maybe maintaining that information. So
we had an interesting conversation with someone the other day where we were talking about the fact that often, certainly in the kinds of work I do, we're often working with big infrastructure projects. And in those situations, we're always talking about how can we scale this up? How can we scale this innovation up? How can we make it work beyond a pilot, for example? And that's absolutely a valid conversation to have. But the other thing we have to think of as well is how do we scale it down so that it can be used on smaller projects or by smaller organisations. And I think at the moment, because we're still kind of trying to grapple with how we use data well and how we cope with floods of data, we're still sort of in that scale-up mode. But reflect on the fact that a huge part of our built environment is created and managed by much smaller organisations, be they local authorities or private sector organisations. We've got to start thinking fairly quickly about how we scale down the processes and make them more tractable for smaller organisations and smaller projects, I think.
Yeah, and with bridging that divide that we just talked about, how businesses operate, and then the vision that is presented in both of these reports and documents, would you say that there is a moral element here that needs to also be studied, because we're talking about having a focus on people, and it's almost quite closely linked to, one could argue, morals and ethics as well.
It absolutely is. And it's particularly apparent, I think, in the city scale work that we're doing. So we have a project in CSIC called Digital Cities for Change. And we set that project up specifically to address the challenges around why smart city programs don't tend to do well, why they rarely get beyond the pilot stage. And really one of the key issues there is that quite often what happens is somebody has a great technology and they're looking for applications for it, and they think, oh, it could be applied in a smart city domain. And that's an absolutely valid observation to make. The problem that we technical people often have is we suffer from technical optimism. And we assume that technology is always the answer and that a technology will always bring a benefit. And the challenge really is, and one of the reasons that smart city initiatives often don't go beyond a pilot stage is because part of the scaling up, coming back to scaling up, needs to include sort of co-design and working with the people for whom that solution is being designed. Otherwise, people feel that things are being imposed on them. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier on, really, that if you're thinking about a socio-technical system, you've absolutely got to think about the people. And one of the challenges with sort of ethics and morals is that if we don't appropriately consult the different stakeholders, and those stakeholders might be businesses, they might be private citizens, they might be residents, there's all kinds of stakeholders often involved in these initiatives, then we will often miss something really important. And one of the big issues that we have is that data is never neutral, particularly when it comes to any kind of data that involves people. But even if you're thinking about, data to do with something very technical like a bridge, if I'm collecting structural health monitoring data on a bridge and I'm not monitoring the key feature that is corroding, that feature may fail and the bridge may fall down, even though I've been monitoring the bridge hugely. Now think about a city full of humans. If I am not aware of the groups within that society that my data isn't capturing. So, for example, the elderly may, if I'm relying on social media, the elderly may not be well represented on social media. There may be people in sort of lower socioeconomic groupings who are unable to access certain services because they don't have ready access to the internet. And that has become very apparent during the pandemic. A huge number of school children have really struggled to learn from home because they have no access at home to the internet, and they probably don't have a computer either. And there have been real challenges for a lot of local authorities when they've been having to send whole classes home. 90% of people in some classes have no access to the internet or a computer at home. How can you possibly teach them? So there is definitely an ethical and a moral element to this. And it's true, whether you're designing infrastructure or thinking about the sort of digital components of that infrastructure. What data do you need? How long do you need to keep it for? Is there data in there about people or not? Mm-hmm. Are we installing our infrastructure in a place where people currently live, and what impact is that going to have? Are we intending to put infrastructure in a place that is currently a huge carbon sink, like going across a peat bog or an ancient woodland or something like that? All of these are moral and ethical issues, and data can enlighten them, but data, if it's not capturing the right things, can bias you. And we won't go into what happened over the summer in various countries, not just the UK, around allocating exam results to final year students. But suffice it to say that misuse of an algorithm, unwitting misuse of an algorithm in that case, can result in very unfair outcomes because data or algorithms are not used thoughtfully and reflectively.
I guess the closest thing to this would be sort of the bias in the data and the bias in the potential algorithms that might be applied to the data.
And that bias can come from missing things out in the data, but also from just our own inherent experiences. Each of us only has our own lived experience. So the case of facial recognition software, that it recognises white blokes in their 20s and 30s very well, but it doesn't recognise brown faces well at all. And it probably doesn't recognise elderly women of any skin tone.
Yeah.
Young white blokes in their 20s and 30s sitting in Silicon is a gross generalisation. But it's not that anyone sets out to do a bad job, it's that our own experience is limited inherently.
I think the next question is very much linked with the moral element as well, which is the current underlying economic thinking of today, which is maximizing growth, limiting our ability to attain flourishing systems? How much does this economic way of current thinking limit us in attaining what you described?
The short answer is yes, it's limiting us. The longer answer is we live in a world of constrained resources, and our economic paradigm, certainly for the last 300 years, has been very much founded on exploitation of resources. And that no longer adds up, because we've reached a point where there are enough people in the world and we're all consuming so much more that we've gone way beyond the resource limit of our planet. So, and even the renewable resources aren't renewing fast enough for the rate at which we wish to use them in order to keep this kind of eternal growth model going. So I think there is absolutely a kind of fundamental inherent need to change the economic models that we use. When we wrote Flourishing Systems, when we started writing it about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, before the COVID pandemic, we were going to include some stuff about different economic models. And at the time, we felt it was a little bit too out there, and that the kind of people that we were aiming Flourishing Systems at in the sort of CEOs of companies and sort of leading policymakers and thinkers wouldn't react well to it. Whereas if I was writing it today, I absolutely would include something about new economic models, because we have the donut economics work that's come out of Oxford. We've got a lot of people thinking about actually how do we live within the resource constraints that our planet has, limit pollution, limit carbon emissions, and really think about creating rethinking the sort of systems that we have around us, not just the infrastructure systems, but the commercial systems and everything else, to promote ongoing flourishing of not just humans, but of the natural environment as well. People are really getting their heads now around the idea that humans only flourish if nature is also flourishing. We are entirely dependent on nature largely for our food, although obviously we're getting some more urban agriculture things going. But even then, that's about nature and biodiversity to some extent. But the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, all of that is processed for us by nature, and we are part of that natural ecosystem. We can't see ourselves as separate from it. So I think there's an urgent imperative to shift away from the sort of traditional economic thinking. And a much smaller example is that I think there's a real need to change the way that we think about sort of the capital cost of projects and the way that we amortize that over a lifetime. Because when you're building infrastructure which is going to last for 100 years, it makes very little sense to offset the cost over 5 years or 20 years. The economic models that we have don't work for that very well, which I think is part of what drives us to focus on upfront capital costs so hard, because we're not using the correct time frame to think about the investments that we're making. So that's the other piece of our economic thinking that I think needs to change, that the time frame needs to be appropriate to the investment that we're making.
Yeah, and I think that the other question that leads on from that is also the ways in which we measure GDP. I mean, this has been also discussed a lot in the context of infrastructure and built environment as well. How much do you see that the ways in which we measure GDP currently influence also the likelihood of achieving that vision?
I think the way we measure GDP is inherently linked to the current economic thinking, and we essentially regard humans as producers and consumers of stuff. And humans are much more complex beings than that. And, there have been an infinite number of studies over the years that show that beyond a certain level of wealth and comfort, getting more doesn't make you happier. So you need to provide for people's basic needs. And, ideally you have a warm home that's dry, and you have rewarding work to go to, and all those other things. But once you get to a certain level of economic capability, having more of it doesn't make you happier in itself. So I think we need to really think about how we measure the sort of success of a country in a way that goes beyond just this idea of GDP. And it's interesting to note, for example, I think in New Zealand, I saw something the other day, that they're starting to bring in other measures of success into the way they are sort of framing their policy ideas. And I wouldn't be surprised if the same kind of thing is happening somewhere like the Netherlands, where you've got this, that Amsterdam's embraced the whole idea of the donut economic model, and saying, yes, everybody needs to have their minimum needs met, but we shouldn't go beyond the maximum capacity of our local environment to serve the needs of our city. And I think those two issues are inherently sort of wrapped together, I think.
I think that nicely concludes. I mean, we could go on and on this topic itself. It's a whole, we would probably have to have some economists in this conversation as well, right? But it is a nice start to thinking about how we need to pay attention to the economic ways of thinking, the models that are driving the investments made in infrastructure as well as the moral side of what we're trying to design and build in the future for the UK infrastructure and the built environment as a whole. So finally, I'll probably put you on the spot here, not to embarrass you, but you are quite a successful, renowned female academic engineer. I'm sure that there are a lot of listeners, including myself, who want to get a bit of personal advice from you on what advice would you give to those that want to make a change in an industry that they see is quite reluctant or also technology averse as well in some ways? What advice would you give to them in their research or perhaps in their work in industry?
One of the things is to do something that you're passionate about, because if you're passionate about it, that will keep you going. If we're talking about trying to create change or impact, I think the other thing is to find other people who think in the same way that you do, and they might be in a different organisation. They might not be in your organisation, but find other people who are trying to make the same change, and work with them. Because if the worst comes to the worst, you can have a nice cathartic conversation over a cup of tea or a pint of beer about, oh my goodness, it's so hard, isn't it? And just hearing that someone else is trying and struggling can help. But hopefully you get beyond the struggle and you get to the point of actually having an impact. So reaching out to others and believing that change is possible is the other thing. It's often, you can look at things and think, oh, I'm just one small person. I can't make a difference. But you look at Greta Thunberg, look at Marcus Rashford, they are both small people who, they're just one person, but they're passionate about something and they make a difference. And we can all do that. We're not all going to be Greta Thunberg and Marcus Rashford, but we can all make a difference in the situation we find ourselves in and with the people we're around. And I think the other thing I would say, particularly in the context of, flourishing systems and climate change and decarbonisation, there's a logical thread there. And technical people love a logical thread. I certainly do. But, there's no point making more money if we're trashing the planet. We're starting to see the impacts becoming faster and faster now, and the urgency, therefore, is building. So just keep plugging the logical argument as well. Be passionate, but explain the logic behind it. I'm not doing this because I like to wear a hair shirt and sandals. I'm doing this because it matters. And people will listen.
Thank you for tuning in to listen to BeyondBIM podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more from our latest episodes, then you can visit BeyondBIM, which is available on SoundCloud and iTunes and all the other major podcast providers.